Sarah Marie Wiebe is an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria, whose research and solidarity work focuses on community development and environmental justice. When we last spoke on the podcast, we looked at her writing broadly, but this time around we're marking the release of her incredible new book, Hot Mess: Mothering Through a Code Red Climate Emergency, from Fernwood Publishing. Hot Mess is a remarkable book, giving readers a nuanced effort to navigate a temporality of disaster, whether the slow disaster of air pollution or the searing trauma of wildfire, while working to manifest the kinds of caring relations that could safeguard the future against the forces of disaster. It's not an impersonal book in the sense that it's not a text that's afraid to let in the emotional avalanche that the lived experience of crisis implies. What happens in and after the moment an emergency is declared? Sarah's book isn't concerned with these questions in the abstract. It offers a detailed account of exactly how and why emergencies are declared and with what effects. The main crisis, and it's really many crises that Wiebe takes on in Hot Mess, is of course the all-encompassing climate crisis. Focusing on the feeling of raising a child in the context of an approaching climate breakdown, Hot Mess lets the reader come to terms with the reality that climate change, as Wiebe tells us, affects all stages of gestation for mothers. We talk about her fieldwork for the book, her defiance of certain norms of academic comportment, especially during her difficult pregnancy, and the question of which medium could potentially function most effectively for communicating the uncanny effects left behind by climate impacts. This new book, Hot Mess: Mothering Through a Code Red Climate Emergency, is sort of exposing academic norms too. Like, there's this really cool story at the beginning that I shared with my partner who dealt with kind of similar experiences of like navigating being pregnant and an academic in a still pretty patriarchal space. And yeah, you tell a story about having to breastfeed during an extreme heat event at a colleague's place. That's one way in which you're directly engaging with kind of academic norms. The other thing is the suspicion that other academics had around the research that you wanted to do, which included some field work in Sarnia, in Chemical Valley. I don't know if we wanted to maybe start there by thinking about the book, its audience, and its kind of place, so to speak, within academia.
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott. I appreciated that you picked up on those vignettes or anecdotes. Actually, when I did my book launch a few months ago and I did a little reading, which I hadn't done before, that kind of reading format, I started with that story about breastfeeding during extreme heat and just feeling so out of sorts and completely like a hot mess. It was a hot day, an unusually hot day, and I just felt completely uncomposed. And but it's very honest, so I suppose this kind of writing attempts to be a little more transparent and honest and raw and real than a lot of academic writing is. And this was a stretch for me. I wanted to be even more personal and real and intimate, but I actually think that in writing this book, which is with Fernwood, they are still an academic press and still expected it to go through peer review and have that formal voice. And so I wrestled with those voices myself, trying to be sort of, an authentic human first and foremost, and then an academic second in some ways. So I don't know if I did manage to strike that balance. I think some of the vignettes are more storied than others, and some a little more academic. I definitely want this book to be somewhat of an intervention in terms of bringing that lived experience and storytelling approach to the forefront. It's definitely a kind of methodology that I advocate for in my academic work. So I feel like I need to set an example. And I just wish that I was a better storyteller. There's a really excellent book by Deborah Thompson, The Long Road Home. It's her story of being a Black academic and moving to the US and back again. And that for me set a really high bar in the kind of writing style that can weave together a really poignant critical political analysis and a storied approach. And so I really appreciate reading more and more material like that has that storied narrative.
It's something that I like about the book. One of the aspects of the book that I find really generous is the way that you are open about the texts that have really inspired you.
Mhm.
Your style as well as your way of thinking and so on. And I think it creates this nice, tapestry where, it's theoretical, but it's also openly affective, and it's also reflecting on the place of and the kind of displaced location of affective writing. That's changed, of course, within at least academia over the last little while. One of your touchstones is Sarah Ahmed, and Judith Butler has that book, The Force of Nonviolence, that you're drawing from. There are these sources that you're building a feminist use of storytelling
Mhm.
to devise. And I thought that autoethnographic kind of style worked. But in terms of climate communication, right? Because the book is also an act of climate communication and an intervention in an ongoing crisis. Um, like to me, like the thing that is nice and refreshing about that autoethnographic style is that it is embodied, it is situated, it is right. It's not this disembodied ongoing book project that just sort of relates the science in one or another register. Um, you talk about these blue feelings, for example, becoming the new normal, and your own child having to adjust to that. Um, so I think I wondered if you wanted to just dig a little bit deeper into how adopting that style helped you think through the personal and political consequences of the climate emergency.
Yeah, I think how we talk about climate change is so vital to that social transformation aspect you mentioned earlier. And there's a few examples that I want to draw out about how I think sharing stories can be transformative. And they're a little bit micro level, but I still think really powerful. And one is that after I started writing this book, I began some research about extreme heat and the impacts on certain populations here in the Capital Regional District of Victoria. And that included seniors living in isolation, newcomers, and pregnant and nursing people. And I remember a few of the sharing circles we had with seniors and just how different they were. And there was this one sharing circle where it was a seniors lunch, and our team of a few researchers, myself and a grad student, showed up, and we handed out the consent forms. And this elderly gentleman was quite annoyed that we were there to interrupt lunch and said to me, "Oh, I don't believe in climate change. I'm not completing your survey. I don't give consent to this study." And I said, "No problem. You're welcome to the lunch, and then you can leave. It's not an obligatory survey or anything." But then I got up to do my little spiel about being a mother and how I had been nursing and the struggle of the heat and dehydration and ending up in the emergency room. And he was captivated, and he listened, and he filled out the consent form. He filled out the survey. He participated in the sharing circle, and he handed me the documents after the hour. And he said, "Thank you for sharing. I didn't really know about how this could affect people, and I learned something, and you're doing a good thing." And it's such a micro example, but it really did make me believe in the power of storytelling. And so this sort of grumpy older gentleman, quite annoyed by my presence there, turned around. And so I do think that it does show that that kind of exchange can create some kind of learning and listening and tweaking of our perspective a little bit. So I really like that example. And then one other one I have is I'm part of a team. The Climate Disaster Project is a team based here at UVic, led by Sean Holman. And we recently helped support the performance of a few theater productions called Eyes of the Beast. And this performance is based on climate disaster stories. So Sean has worked with a theater company to produce these plays, and they were held here on campus at UVic, and they'll be in Vancouver in the new year. And it's organized around this theme of policy listening. And so Sean invited policymakers to the performance, and they had the duty to listen to the dialogue after the play. So they would sit through the play, listen to the dialogue, and then engage in kind of a reporting back session and a discussion. And so that was another really interesting moment of storytelling, witnessing performance, feeling touched by it. The one that I went to had, a leader of a provincial party here in British Columbia, and this was before the election, and gave her remarks, and spent time with us, that whole evening, and reported back and talked about how the performance, shifted her thinking, and how it led to kind of her hope for the future of the province. And so I thought that was another really interesting model of how storytelling and narrative can be relevant to policy decision making and sort of strategizing and agenda setting. So these are a few examples that I think also speak to the power of storytelling. And I hope that, Hot Mess can be sort of part of this conversation, one of the stories in the mix.
Yeah, no, I love the ways in which it's trying to convey with this stylistic flourish the embodied experience of being a mother in the context of a climate emergency. And I want to, come back to the particularity of that and how you explore it in the book. But something you touched on there reminded me of the way the book and so much of your work talks about Indigenous solidarity, which is a complex idea in some ways, like implying a level of sympathy, connection across distance, perhaps, and maybe the ability to like engage with and respond to the experience of Indigenous peoples. I interviewed Jennifer Wickham recently, who is a co-director of Yinta, a film that when I saw that it, was picked up by Netflix, I was like, this is incredible. This is what we want. Netflix being an evil corporation aside, we want the dissemination of this kind of storytelling. And yet when I talked to her, she was, to her, the struggle is not over, right? Like this is one piece of a larger project. When you think about like a more radical, practical allyship with Indigenous peoples, is it one that just is mainly about people getting engaged directly? And does it come from, in your experience, that thing that you talk about in the book, which is a fierce commitment, you say, and dedication to the environment, a fervent love and passion, or a sense of refusal, basically, of corporate interests that want to extract from, you say, vital life-giving forces.
I've seen that film, and I do think it's really powerful, and I'm glad that it's on Netflix and making that intervention. I think that's important, that there are these kind of mainstream interventions, even if they are in the kind of corporate arena. And I appreciate as well that the struggle is not over, that the fight absolutely continues. And I have been thinking a lot about what it means to be a non-Indigenous researcher trying to work in solidarity with communities. And one concept that has really come to mind and to light lately is being quiet, actually. And so not always trying to be the one to speak on behalf of communities or speak necessarily out, or figuring out where your voice is most relevant and useful. So I have done a lot of work now for over 10 years with the Aamjiwnaang Nation, and more recently with Attawapiskat, and I talk a little bit about those collaborations in Hot Mess, and cultivating sort of gentle relationships over time. And I have noticed there are so many different styles of working in solidarity, and some are a little bit more of this like guardian model. I'm sort of like the defender of truth or solidarity, but I have really noticed that, when working in sort of a research context with Indigenous leaders and myself a little bit more in a supportive role, that there is a place for non-Indigenous people to take cues from those Indigenous leaders and just be ready to offer your skills and services and not always be seeking the limelight. I think there's a little bit of a danger in academia because we're so rewarded on, getting grants and her name in the media or producing, cutting edge research and all of that. That's the model, that's how it kind of rewards us. But that's not really challenging some of the problems with academia and the extractive values that a lot of different institutions are based upon. And so it's hard. So I think listening, being quiet, being kind of quietly behind the scenes doing, your research, and trying to share burdens and leadership. And it's not always easy. It definitely requires a lot of delicate communication and conversations. But it's something I've certainly been thinking a lot about. And I know for myself, when working in a place like Attawapiskat, for instance, I kind of went with my agenda at the beginning. I had, a workshop sort of designed and planned, and it didn't really work very well because it was sort of me in the front of the room and trying to get people talking about my ideas. And it just
Hmm.
didn't work. It fell flat. And so it was a good learning moment for me to realize I need to just quietly learn and listen and build these gentle relationships over time and stay in the community longer than I planned to, and just work one-on-one, go out on the land with people, go swimming in the river, and just do these more kind of embodied things, share food together. Um,
Hmm.
so that's been on my mind a lot lately, is that kind of quiet solidarity and not trying to always be the
Hmm.
face of different movements, and just taking more guidance, I think, from Indigenous leaders and amplifying their voices and their stories. So I think as educators, we can show those documentaries, we can have conversations, and I think providing that education is a really powerful way of intervening back in the institutional academic context as well.
For sure. Yeah, well said. And like in particular, the kind of dangers of the rewards of academia and the kind of ill-begotten wealth that's concentrated there. Being self-aware of that and taking stock of the narcissism that can come from being really deeply entrenched in academic values. And I like that you did politicize there, like what is valued? Like that's what we're talking about. And the way that you framed it is like, I'm just in a room getting people to talk about my ideas. Like that is as crude as it can be a lot of the time. And yet that is normalized as like an appropriate mode of knowledge translation or something. So yeah, I mean, like you're hesitant to be heavy-handed with these ideas, but you're still, trying to build a conceptual framework in the book for thinking about extractivism in 2024. And one of the ideas that you kind of drop in is blue bureaucracy, and it's not a term that you repeat a lot in the book. And the tool that I think blue bureaucracy is supposed to be in this text is one that identifies the fact that there is an incredible asymmetry of power when it comes to determining what you call global climate futures. So we're in this situation where there's like utter stagnation at the national level, seemingly, when it comes to like the kind of action that's required, the kind of care, let's say, that's required. From your perspective, thinking again about what Hot Mess is arguing and blue bureaucracy, how can something like radically eco-feminist circular economy model contest what we have, which is this extractivist, highly stratified, asymmetrical one? That's a big one. I apologize.
Yeah, no, there's lots there to riff off of, and I appreciate your attention to the concept of blue bureaucracy, because I agree with you that it is sort of offered, and then it's not fully fleshed out in terms of being a guiding framework for the entire book, but it certainly evokes a certain tone, I think, for that particular chapter or vignette, which is Code Blue, which focuses on a few different layered feelings. And so code blue is usually the hospital code for
Right.
heart failure, like a cardiac arrest. And so I think of it as this kind of like heartbreak or heartache kind of feeling. And so for me,
Mhm.
I'm oriented to the ocean in that moment. So thinking about how oceans are so affected by heat. And then I think in particular about the billion sea creatures that died during the heat dome in BC.
Mhm.
But then I also think of oceans as these places of solace and health and regeneration. And so it's a really complicated setting that evokes so many feelings all at once. But it is really this kind of harbinger of climate change. We know that oceans are warming, there's sea level rise, there's all these concerns. So we do have to be paying attention to oceans. And then how we relate to oceans, they are so heavily bureaucratized in certain contexts. And so
Mhm.
that vignette talks about these different forms of instrumental ways of relating to oceans through these managerial practices or the extractive practices that cause harm, and they're not as relational or caring as they could
Mhm.
be. And so in your remarks just now, you really hit on one of the core contributions, I hope, of this book, which is to center care and more
Right.
caring relations to more than human worlds and environments rather than extractive ones, which is the status quo, the capitalist status quo. So when I've spoken about this work more recently, I have this slide that underlines care, and it's bold and says, if you remember one word from this presentation, think about care. And I more
Mhm.
recently started reading Joan Tronto's Care Democracy or Caring Democracy, and it really
Mhm.
resonates with Hot Mess. And so I wish that I had read it sooner, actually. But these two books could be read in conversation with one another. So certainly, Blue Bureaucracy is this stirring kind of concerned tone about the ways in which governments and decision makers and corporations relate to our ocean environments, and encourages
Mhm.
us to think differently about um, the more than human ways we can connect to oceans. And that certainly came to light for me a lot when I was based in Hawaii, where aloha aina values and circular economies were much more front and center. And
Mhm.
so you mentioned circular economies, which is picked up a little bit more in the following vignette around Code Green. And
Mhm.
sometimes I'm asked, like, is a circular economy radical enough? The answer is no,
Mm.
actually, it's not radical enough, but
Right.
it is that
I wasn't gonna
incremental.
ask you that question. I I kinda know it's not radical enough, but I think that's okay. It would be nonetheless extremely radical as an alternative to what we have, right? The take, make, waste model.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
Totally. It is somewhat in the category of like individual responsibility, and I never want to make it seem like the solutions to our
Right.
systemic problems of climate change, which are linked to capitalism and all kinds of paternalism, patriarchal values, and so on. I think the individual responsibility is not the end destination or not the only thing to focus on.
Right.
But I do think that, yeah, if we can reduce our consumptive practices and reduce our waste, that circular economies can be beneficial. And what's unique about the way in which many Kanaka Maoli leaders are talking about it in Hawaii is that it's not just about challenging capitalism, it's also about the resurgence of culture and centering community practices, grassroots practices that can transform our modes of producing food, for example, or healing and health
Right.
centers, and creating these kind of connective centers that get people, connected to their environment in much more radically intimate and different ways. And
Mhm.
so I think there's a lot to learn from colleagues in Hawaii.
Yeah, no, and the book does talk about those experiences in Hawaii, and I wanted to, yeah, ask you about that. I mean, it obviously is part of this stated strategy of wanting to share experiences of climate impacts, and places like Maui have been hit with apocalyptic climate impacts of the type we're now seeing in Malibu and other places, where people end a semester at school watching the earth go up in flames around their university, right? Like this is now, as you say, part of the new normal of this blue bureaucracy, a bureaucracy of resignation or something. But in Hawaii, you're relating other kinds of emergencies and relating to other kinds of emergencies, like the one experience you described when studying there's an emergency alert that goes out in Hawaii that a ballistic missile could be incoming. You talk about how you'd never felt the all-encompassing presence of the U.S. military like you did in Hawaii, which is not a thing that people who haven't been there maybe understand, right? Like the actual scale of military presence in Hawaii. Can you speak to how letting other people into those kinds of harrowing, often traumatic experiences can have a political impact, even now in this moment where it feels like we are um, very differently saturated, I think, by images of violence and devastation?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
And one of the sub themes of the book is environmental violence. And so there's a few vignettes that talk
Mhm.
about that a little more directly than others. So Code Red certainly talked about like climate change and climate emergencies and that sort of violence on the earth. But Code Orange specifically looks at Chemical Valley and kind of everyday environmental violence and racism that's happening there. And then if you zoom ahead a few chapters later, the Code Black chapter talks most directly about violence. There's a lot about environmental racism and violence in that chapter, but then also these other forms as well. And so that uh, vignette does open with this kind of alert that I did receive during my very first year as a faculty member at the University of Hawaii, which was about this notification, this false threat, but nevertheless one that felt very real for many of us. My colleagues who study international relations, international security, they believed it to be real. And I actually thought this can't be real. That was my first thought, that this is
Right.
not possible. But the fact that my colleagues who are American, some of whom are American and study international relations, they were in their bathtubs with their families, had taped the windows, like they were treating this as a
Right.
very real event. And I was
Hmm.
on the phone to neighbors trying to figure out what to do. I watched people like gather together and go into bathtubs together and try to figure out what was going on. It was 45 minutes of waiting. So that was pretty alarming to say the least. And that same year, there were concerns around neo-fascism on campus. There were also opportunities to do active shooter training. I remember at one point going to a boxing gym with colleagues. We were doing self-defense training. It was a totally different level of awareness of violence that I was just not familiar with. Being
Hmm.
from Canada, being a privileged person from Canada. So that vignette talks about all these kind of distinct but yet connected forms of violence that were happening all at once, from environmental violence to militarization. And there's so many unfortunate examples of the legacy of bombing in places like Kaho'olawe off of Maui for years, that were
Hmm.
bombed by the U.S. military, but that are sacred sites of cultural significance. And so I do feel that in raising awareness about these impacts and these concerns, that is part of trying to be in solidarity with many Kanaka Maoli leaders who have for a really long time been speaking out about their concerns. And I had the opportunity to go to Kaho'olawe with colleagues for a educational and cultural learning opportunity, and got to see kind of firsthand the significance of a site like that was so heavily militarized, but then also witness the leadership of community members trying to clean up the contamination and rebuild and envision alternative sustainable decolonial futures, trying to see what would solar look like, what would wind or these other kind of different energy sort of renewable technologies look like in a place like that. So that was a very eye-opening experience to um, kind of experience the alert threat, and then also go to a place like Kaho'olawe, and then now to kind of think back about all the layered forms of violence that are taking place.
That gives people, I think, a really helpful kind of access point for thinking about the experiences that you're working through in the book, and also for me, it kind of opens up a conversation about the role of visual culture, because folks that talk about the punishment of Gaza, for example, the 100 Years War on Palestine, talk about how you really can't understand the militarization of that border until you go there. Gaza, though, has been, of course, represented on screen many times. And now, at the height, you could say, of the Palestinian liberation movement, has been represented on screen more than it ever has since October 7th. And I often wonder what impact visual culture is having, basically, if we can actually bring ourselves to watch these scenes of destruction. I feel like we're necessarily changed by them. You've done a lot of work as a filmmaker, actually going out and trying to capture a number of different experiences, people, struggling and succeeding and forming, the kinds of networks of solidarity that are required to actually like withstand the state or withstand corporate power. I wondered if you want to talk about like the nuances of, being in those places and trying to, as an academic sort of build your own argument perhaps while capturing this stuff, and how a light touches may be important there. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, everything you mentioned there reminds me of how important it is to connect lived experience to policy concerns and issues. And being based here in a school of public
Mm,
administration, I am thinking about decision making all the time and governance structures and the problem of top down authority versus collaborative and collegial governance and decision making.
mm,
And so I had the opportunity to teach a course a year ago on government and governance. And it was really great to have the opportunity to kind of reframe the course around ecological governance. And we did some land based learning. So we went out to a site called Sneakwith, which is near Butchart Gardens. And it's a fascinating site because it's in the shadow of this really prosperous, in the kind of conventional capitalist sense, this prosperous tourist destination. Everyone that goes to Victoria, goes to Butchart Gardens. And then in the shadow, or just adjacent to Butchart Gardens, is the site along Gowland Todd. It's traditional Wasanic territory. And this nonprofit, Wasanich-led nonprofit, Papakenhout, is actively, removing invasive species and restoring the land and replanting. And so our students would go and learn about the land and the cultural significance and get their hands dirty. And I think that's such an important way for them to learn about policy and governance and decision making. And I had them do this exercise where they formed different groups and represented various interests, like the Butchart Family and Foundation, Papakenhout, and then the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and tried to discuss how would they kind of clean up this site, because there's a legacy of contamination due to the Portland cement factory years
right.
ago. And so there's all these like broken pieces of workers camps still in this land. And so I remember at one point like shoveling out an old toilet and saying to a student, wow, we are literally cleaning out the shit of our ancestors. And that was just such a real moment of just realizing like
Mhm.
you have to have that hands-on experience. Otherwise, I don't think it's the same as, reading text or listening to a lecture or even having a discussion. I just don't think it's as maybe rich and meaningful and I guess stirring or affective as being out and
Mm,
connecting with people and learning from places and lands and waters that are really directly affected by decisions that are often really far away. So many times I speak with, policy officials who they don't leave their cubicles or their boardrooms very often. They're making these decisions based
yeah.
on text-based documents. And so having our students go out and meet with community leaders and have those kinds of experiences, I do think it can be really transformative, and it is very embodied and experiential. And unfortunately, academia doesn't reward that kind of learning all that often. I know that our on campus
Mm,
experiential learning office is like an office of one, and there's these small grants you can apply for to do those activities, but you have to apply well in advance. And there's not that kind of continuous sustainable funding you can access, so doing that kind of learning is challenging, and there's a lot of ethics to consider as well. But I am such an advocate for that kind of experiential learning. And then even in research as well, with the Chemical Valley example, there are community
mhm.
members that will take really high level UN officials, high level kind of civil servants on these toxic tours, to give a sense of place to decision makers so that they know the impact of what they're making decisions on. And that's so critical, because otherwise, people are just making these decisions kind of in ignorance and not really understanding cumulative impacts and how people's everyday lives are affected. And something like the smell
Yeah,
of different chemicals in Chemical Valley, you just can't get that from a textbook or even from a newscast or
definitely
documentary.
not.
You do have to experience it.
Maybe from art, maybe from an attempt by a poet to capture it perfectly, but it's not, nothing like actually seeing it firsthand. And you do, you talk about your experiences with Sarnia and the difference between, being directly exposed to these petrochemicals that have a noxious quality, right? and how that can be formative and destructive, of course. And the difference between that and seeing it as just like an abstract problem, like understanding and being able to talk about environmental racism is maybe different from really, really dwelling with it. There's a part in the book where, you just basically say this was by design. This was not an accident, right? You say over the years, an assemblage of petrochemical and polymer refineries came to dominate the landscape. What assumptions maybe are you trying to debunk or expose in saying, like, don't imagine that this happened by accident. This was by design, and most of these impacts were intentionally inflicted upon this place.
Yeah. And it's so important to ask those questions too. And what I'm encouraged by is that the federal government just passed this Bill
Mm.
C-226, an act to address environmental racism and enhance environmental justice. And I'm encouraged by this bill because I think it discursively is putting questions like you're just asking on the table at the forefront, and saying to decision makers, you have to take this seriously. What I'm a little more cautious about or curious to see what will happen is how communities will be kind of fairly compensated that are already affected. I think this bill will help moving forward. It will bring a different intersectional lens, I think, an environmental justice lens to future decision making and planning and policy. But it's less clear how it's going to help those communities who are already really affected by these everyday violences. And I guess my concern in saying that earlier comment about how this is not done by accident is because sometimes what we see is taken for granted. Even speaking with young people from Amjadang over the years, some of them would tell me, "Oh, I didn't even know that there was an issue with the refineries because it's so normal for them. They grew up there. They thought they would work in the plants, and so it just becomes sort of normalized. And so really trying to denormalize or denaturalize what we take for granted and challenge the status quo is part of the ethos here. And I think that Ingrid Waldron's work does a really good job of that too, highlighting these different kind of cases across Canada and how these industrial sites are often next to communities of color. And I don't know that Canadians know enough about that. We're not learning about that in like socials classes in high school. I think, again, it's part of the education that's really needed so that those who are in those positions of power and, making decisions in whether it's like Ministry of Environment offices and giving those certificates of approval to facilities, like we need those people to have the education so they know that it's not acceptable, basically. So I think we do have a lot of power, again, as educators. And I feel like a big responsibility of being in a school of public administration to get these students thinking really critically, because they are going to be in these positions of decision making and power and reporting up to their authorities who will be writing these permit slips basically for different industrial developments.
Man, there's a lot there. But yeah, I know you don't have much more time, so I want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a little bit about visual culture. It's apparently the case, according to RE Climate, that images of some climate impacts are being consumed not as, troubling and traumatic things, but as spectacle. Like wildfires are kind of impressive to look at,
Right.
right? And that's concerning.
Yeah.
I wonder, when you think about what Hot Mess could have been, there are all kinds of different forms it could have taken. Short documentary, graphic novel. I was thinking video game for whatever reason, like an indie developer. That's a storytelling medium as well. Have you thought at all, because you've experienced so many different media and different performances and experiments with arts-based policy interventions. What medium do you think can maybe maximize the political potential of these embodied experiences of climate disaster?
Yeah, I like what you said about like maybe video games. That's a neat one to consider. Podcasts, I think, are another great example for
Right. Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Hot Mess will be an audiobook, which I think is great because I think
Sure.
sometimes people are busy and maybe don't have the time to sit down and read a book, and maybe for pleasure they don't want to read one about climate change. They might want to read something
Mm.
more joyful. There are moments of joy in the book, but so I think that, yeah, an audio book format will be helpful for that. I do think the performance actually aspect is quite exciting to see. I was really, really encouraged by the performance of Eyes of the Beast here at UVic, and I'm excited to see what happens when it kind of goes on tour a little bit. But the challenge is how to get the right people in the room, in the audience, because I think
Mm.
people who are signing up to come in their free time to a play on about climate change and climate survivor stories, they probably already care. They're probably already informed. So I
Mhm.
am really curious about how do we make those interventions. And when I think back to the story I shared earlier about like disrupting the elderly gentleman's lunch, like that was a
Mm.
productive interruption. It led to some kind of learning. So how do we get people in, the same
Mm.
space where they can have these meaningful exchanges? One thing I would like to think about are those sort of climate assembly formats where you have people organized from different backgrounds across a range of perspectives and lived experiences, and come together and sort of deliberate and discuss particular maybe recommendations or strategies they'd like to see. Because it's not that often that we're in these sort of collegial atmospheres of discussion with people who might have totally different values. And I'm
Mhm.
just really curious about that. How do we come together and discuss issues we care about? Presumably, everyone cares about changes to the weather. That might be the common ground. And then, so how do we kind of
Yeah.
come together and share? And I think the visual aspect is really powerful. I was in Kelowna recently speaking about hot mess, and that's a really interesting place to be talking about
Oh, you bet.
hot mess. And I went to the art gallery, and there were several exhibitions with art about wildfire, and
Mm.
many photographs, many art installations. So that's a really important intervention. I think having an art gallery right downtown where you can walk in and see that expression. But I was also taken on a walking tour to the base of Knox Mountain, where someone showed me where the fire jumped the lake, and just kind of seeing the tree line now, the really much more like withered down kind of tree line because of the damage of the wildfire. And yeah, a lot of people that I spoke to had a story. They had a story about their experience of that wildfire, sort of how normalized it is. But a lot of people describe watching it. So many people who lived in the urban city of Kelowna watched it, and some were fearful and others less fearful. So I found that really interesting, just the way people related to that experience. But I do recall speaking with one person who shared with me their evacuation plan, and that their neighborhood was evacuated and they had to go elsewhere. And just the privilege of that, like being
Right.
evacuated somewhere comfortable if you can pay for a hotel, and others who just sort of had to flee, maybe didn't have somewhere to go. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, so I was reminded again of the importance of needing that kind of critical intersectional lens to look at how people are differently affected by these extreme weather events. And that is part of where I think my research will go in the future, is bringing that intersectional lens to better understand the lived experience, the diversity and nuances of people's experience of these events, and how they can inform better policy alternatives. Because right now there's so much reaction. It's kind of a reactive governance model, and not a lot of like
Mm.
collaborative collective decision making and policy transformation. So I am curious about all of that in terms of what are the spaces available. Are these kind of citizen assembly models, deliberative spaces, places for that? I've started using the term care assemblies or care forums, which would be like community action responses to extreme weather events, because I think extreme weather is a phrase that a lot of people can connect to, whether it's fire or droughts or storms, bomb cyclone we heard here recently, atmospheric rivers. There
Mhm.
are these extreme weather events that we're seeing, and having people come together and discuss their experiences, their maybe barriers to accessing public shelter during these events, but then also the recommendations. That is something that I would like to see more of and plan to do in my research moving forward, like convening some of these spaces.
Yeah, and I think that will be incredibly valuable. I think I agree with you that there's a lot of potential in that form of kind of outreach, and seeing what kinds of muscles get reanimated by bringing people together in these spaces that feel new because they're politically charged and because it feels like something very real is at stake. And it's interesting to consider, the pursuit of those spaces of meaningful engagement, as you've called it in other work, in terms of the temporality of disaster. Because you talk about like these slow disasters, like ongoing air pollution in places like Chemical Valley, and then these fast disasters, like wildfires, that are we sometimes call natural disasters, despite what's going on. Speaking about it instead in terms of protecting the things that we love most, the places and the people that we're connected to, has the greatest resonance. And that's why I think Hot Mess being specifically about mothering through a climate emergency, is hopefully a book that will have a lot of resonance for a lot of people. I mean, when it comes to something like air quality, it is in many communities mothers that have rallied in defiance of the sources of that and saw real change as a result. Obviously, it came from your own experience, but can you speak to why you think the description or the kind of working through deconstructing almost of that experience during a climate emergency can be also a bit of a lens for thinking about just being in crisis generally, being overwhelmed, feeling, powerless at times, given the possibility of imminent emergency at any point.
Yeah, and I always cared about climate change and the climate emergency, but not in the same way, not to the same extent as during the heat dome in BC.
Sure.
And being a new parent and feeling really vulnerable in a way that I already felt vulnerable as a new parent and already felt like, my routines were not regular anymore, a lot of sleepless nights, and it's this blurry kind of phase of motherhood. And so then you add to this mix a heat dome and extreme dehydration and going to the hospital. And so for me it just felt really embodied in a way that I wasn't quite aware of before. And so it was definitely in that hospital waiting room where I was there for hours and hours and hours, because I was not the only person there that really busy day. um, that it just felt like a hot mess, like the sticky feeling, the sweaty, and just all these other bodies there, and this lack of certainty around when I would get treatment or be seen, and being kind of separated from my newborn at the time. It was a very stressful experience. And I came out of that thinking, well, I'm not alone. There were a lot of other people in that waiting room. And so I'm sure other people care about this too. So on the one hand, I was very stressed and very concerned and really, sick and not well hydrated. And then the other, I felt a little bit encouraged to know other people must care about this too. And so when I was back at work, I guess it would have been about 6 months later or so, when I was back at work and I was approached by some community planners to start this research project, I was very interested because I knew that through this project we could kind of convene conversations at the community level, bring together policy folks, community leaders, people with lived experience, and try to come up with some recommendations. So I guess my hope is that people can feel a little bit of comfort in that hot mess scenario. I find that the phrase hot mess is very relatable for a lot of people. I was giving the copy to a journalist, and on the way to drop it off, I was chatting with the security staff who looked at the book and said, oh, this is relatable. I can, relate to this term. And so I hope that people kind of see themselves somewhat in this work and can have conversations about it and, not ignore these extreme weather events or these climate disaster or climate emergency events, but take them seriously and have a bit more of a language to talk about it, because it's not always easy to know what to say during these sort of traumatic events. And so I think just adding to that conversation, adding some language, adding some space for that can be helpful, maybe somewhat cathartic. It was for me. I tell everyone that I I write through pain. That's how I ended up writing this book. Is, I had a difficult birth, as I described in the Code Pink vignette, and so luckily my kid was a very good sleeper, and I would journal and take notes and kind of worked on a book proposal over the course of my leave. I was able to kind of write through that pain with the hope of being able to cultivate more conversations like this about these topics that I think need to be had. They're difficult, but that's super critical.
Yeah, no, it's difficult reading at times, for sure. The book is not, like, if that person that looked at your book and saw Hot Mess, it's not Confessions of a Shopaholic. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just like, we're a bunch of hot messes. No, it's saying, there's a line in the book where you say, healthy homes, lands, and waters are crucial to healthy hearts and minds. That's the kind of book we're talking about. You know what I mean? It's a book where, it is hard at times to read. The story of your unplanned C-section is gripping, but not easy reading, And so I think like that combined with these messages of grounded hope really make it an extraordinary book. I want to share one more quote and then I'll let you go. But folks should pick up the book. You say, mothers might feel this grief and the connected responsibilities in a profound way. To cope and chase that elusive glimmer of hope, I find myself turning to alternative economic and political systems that center care and community connections. Thank you so much for talking to me. It's a really wonderful book.
My pleasure.